Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and today we're doing another one of the Would It Run on MiSTer video series, because you guys seem to absolutely love these, and I get a ton of comments about different platforms, and one of the leading questions I get is whether or not the DE10 Nano and MiSTer itself could handle Namco System 22, because some of Namco's greatest arcade games from the 90s are on those boards. Pretty much everyone's played at least one in arcades, and everyone wants to know if they would work. So we're going to go over the board, the specs, MiSTer FPGA, and talk about whether or not Namco System 22 could fit within the logic and capabilities of MiSTer. Before I get too far involved, though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But obviously when you think of Namco System 22, the first game that comes to mind is Ridge Racer. However, there are three different Ridge Racer games on the System 22 board: Ridge Racer 2, and Rave Racer. They're all running on the same base hardware, but what we have to talk about is the fact that System 22 is actually two different boards. When you're thinking of System 22, you may be very well thinking of Namco's Super System 22, which shares a lot of the same hardware in common, but does have a lot of changes. So do be aware that when you think about this thing, you think of two boards. Now, why am I putting Hyper Neo Geo 64 on the screen? Well, one, we talked about that last week, but two, it's a reference on just how complicated these arcade boards can be with custom silicon. Namco System 22 is a little bit of a pain, and I actually do not own one in my collection, believe it or not. Now, something like Rave Racer here is running on the stock System 22 hardware, and that is what we're going to talk about first when we talk about the specs. But basically, the original System 22 doesn't have that many games on it. Something like Prop Cycle, one of the most inventive and interesting Namco games in arcades, runs on this Super System 22 board, so I just want to delineate that at the beginning, that we're going to be going over one arcade board, the second arcade board, the similarities and changes in hardware, and how that would affect the potential of any of these games running on MiSTer FPGA. So for System 22 in and of itself, use a Motorola 68020, and that is a cut-down variant. You're going to see that it uses two custom sound CPUs, as well as two Texas Instrument digital signal processors, or DSPs. Now on the CPU side of things, we can take a full look at what the 68020 is, whether it's in its full fat configuration or its cut down lower bus bit version on the EC model. This is not anything that MiSTer FPGA would have any issues with whatsoever on the CPU side of things. That is because for the most part, the 68020 or variants can work on MiSTer FPGA. You're going to see this chip has been used by the Amiga 1200 and the Amiga CD32. Obviously we have that Amiga core used by Namco System 22, the Taito F3, and the Konami GX. This is a very popular processor, so much so that it was supposed to go into the Atari Jaguar 2 had that actually seen a retail release. So this is not in any way, shape, or form an exotic or foreign processor. 68000 code and its variants are very well known. Now obviously if we take a look at something like Amiga, we have a similar processor running on MiSTer FPGA now. If we take a look at a racing game, it's obvious that the MiSTer can handle at least the CPU. But the thing about arcade boards is a lot of times the CPU is not the most powerful thing inside of the metal box. A lot of those DSPs were very exotic and very different than what you're used to at home. And obviously something like Ridge Racer looks nothing like the Amiga in motion. That is going to always come down to all of the custom hardware and all of the different hardware that is on top of the CPU. So we don't have any problems on the CPU side as of yet for this running on MiSTer FPGA. We do need to deal with a lot of things because obviously the Amiga can't output the 3D capabilities of the System 22. That's just because they share a CPU in common and pretty much nothing else whatsoever. Now you'll see here that we do have those two sound CPUs and the two DSPs. The DSPs are really going to be doing a lot of the 3D heavy lifting. But the thing about Namco System 22 is there's also a metric crap ton of custom chips on board that we'll get into in a moment. So many of these boards, their specs aren't even 100% truly known outside of the people that develop them, because a lot of the silicon on board is just fully custom. Yes, this works in MAME, yes, there's the ability to emulate this, but to actually understand what each and every custom chip is doing would require a lot of delitting of chips and a lot of reverse engineering. I mean, obviously Nintendo 64 can do a lot with the clock speeds of their chips, and we can get a racing game here, but so much is known about Nintendo 64 versus Namco System 22. What I want you to get into your head is the idea that a lot of emulation makes presumptions on how the hardware works, and it works perfectly fine in emulation, but if you try to bring that over to FPGA, it may be a more difficult lift. And let's talk about the games that you would get from this. You would get Ace Driver and the sequel Ace Driver Victory Lap, which are very similar. They're almost in and of themselves the same game. You'll get Cyber Commando, which is a fun time, but nothing that's going to be a Hall of Fame first level ballot game. And you get Rave Racer, Ridge Racer, and Ridge Racer 2. Now there's a couple other games on this board. They're going to be full-size simulations. I don't even believe those have been dumped, so it's not anything that could run on MiSTer FPGA, because for the most part, those ROMs don't even exist. But take a look at something like Alpine Surfer. Maybe this is a game that you remember being on the System 22. This is a Super System 22 game. They look very similar, they play very similar, and they have a very similar graphical style. That is because they share a lot of hardware in common, but in fact they are slight deviations of the same platform. Dirt Dash, one of my favorite Namco racing games of all time, runs on the Super System 22. So a lot of the games you may have in your head might not actually run on the stock board. Now if we move over to the specs of this System Super 22 hardware, you're going to see they are both similar and different at the same time. We have the exact same CPU, but the sound CPU is going to change. It's going to change to Mitsubishi, a single chip versus 2 custom Namco units. You're also going to have the same 3 digital signal processors on board, so that works in conjunction, but this has more graphical power, and we'll explain how that works in just a moment. But hear what it sounds like from the CPU, and enjoy. System 22 and Super System 22 always had good sounding hardware, that's for sure. And you'll see here on the digital signal processors are the exact same units that are on System 22. So if you can stand up the CPU and you can stand up the DSPs, you need to configure 2 different sound CPUs as well as 2 different sound chips to get all of these games running. And this is where it really starts getting difficult. You are making a lot of work for a handful of games, and you're going to see here that it says an insanely large amount of Namco custom chips. That is not false whatsoever. There are so many chips on board System 22 and Super System 22 that would have to be fully understood, almost even more so than the Hyper Neo Geo 64, which I just recently talked about. Arcade boards have a ton of custom silicon, and a lot of their specs are not known whatsoever. Something like Aquajet here, it does look better than a System 22 game, but it has the same CPU and the same DSPs. That means one of those customs that nobody really knows what it does must be aiding in the horsepower equation to make System 22 look better. It's possible that one of those custom chips could be doing some math setup on the triangle engine to do a little bit of the polygon calculation. It could be doing any number of things, and pretty much for the most part you'd have to reverse engineer every single one of them. So here's the deal on Namco System 22. As far as the baseboard with the CPU, the sound CPU, and the DSPs, I bet you could get them running on MiSTer FPGA if you really wanted to. None of the clock speeds are going to affect anything whatsoever. When you get to System Super 22, you do have the same chips, but you have even more customs. But both of these boards are littered with customs. They have so many chips on them, you would think it was the chip and dip bowl from your last Super Bowl party. That's how messy these boards are. They were purpose built to do one thing by engineers who understood how to make it work. To try to reverse engineer these things would be a monumental task, and while you do get some awesome games, I don't know if it'd actually be worth it because we do have it in MAME. But honestly, with all the custom chips on board and having to string 2 DSPs, 2 CPUs, and 2 sound CPUs together to make this work, I really don't see Super System 22 or even System 22 ever being feasible on MiSTer FPGA. It has the logic that it has the capabilities that it has, but arcade hardware was never really elegantly designed. The Nintendo 64 probably is way more powerful than Super System 22 ever would be on paper, and it has a much more concise architecture. Arcade boards would throw chips at the wall to see what stuck, and they would use each and every one of them. It's possible a lot of those customs, 90% of what they do may have never been used in-game, but you have to string it together to make it work. So in an optimistic world, I'd love to say this one is a maybe, but I am 99% sure System 22 and Super System 22 are just no-go territory on MiSTer FPGA, and probably for FPGAs in a long time coming. Short of that, we're done, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.